you are just such a brilliant young man doing really awesome things. So
Thank you. Oh,
congratulations, buddy.
thank you so much. You know, I just feel like
Robert and Terri Irwin break down over Bindi. The truth finally comes out. She had smiled through everything, through losing her father at 9 years old, through raising a family inside a zoo, through surgeries, silence, and years of pain. She never mentioned it on camera. But on this particular day, the smile was gone. And what Robert Irwin said next, in front of a live audience, sent shockwaves through everyone. The Irwins have built an empire on openness, wildlife, warmth, khaki shirts, and carefully managed grief. So why are they falling apart now after nearly 2 decades of holding it together? What is Bindi Irwin not telling us? The family the world fell in love with the year.
honestly, like, she's just the most kind, just genuine person that you'll ever meet. And now to see her as a mum, it's just amazing. She is such a good mum.
Is 2026, and somewhere off the coast of Queensland, Australia, a stingray does what stingrays almost never do. It strikes one barb, directly into the chest of a 44-year-old man who had spent his entire life around deadly animals and somehow always walked away. This time, he did not walk away. Steve Irwin, the crocodile hunter, was gone in minutes, and in an instant, the most beloved wildlife family on the planet was shattered. His daughter Bindi was 8 years old. His son Robert was 2. His wife Terri had just lost her husband, her best friend, and the entire architecture of the life she had built. The world grieved loudly. Flags were lowered in Australia. Tributes poured in from every corner of the planet. World leaders spoke his name. Millions of people who had never met him cried for him. And then the cameras turned toward his family, and everyone had the same quiet, unspoken question. What happens to them now? Here is what most people expected. They expected Terri to sell, pack up, take the children back to Oregon, where she was from originally, and disappear quietly into private life. Nobody would have blamed her. A widow with a toddler and a grieving 8-year-old, managing a zoo with over 1,000 animals in a country that was not even hers by birth. Most people would have run. Terri Irwin did not run. She stayed. She kept the zoo, she kept the cameras, she kept Steve's name alive with a ferocity that surprised even the people closest to her. And for a long time, it looked like the right call. Australia Zoo in Beerwah, Queensland became more than a tourist attraction. It became a pilgrimage site. People flew in from across the world specifically to stand where Steve Irwin had stood, to feel something close to him. And every time they arrived, there was Terri, smiling, welcoming, khaki shirt pressed, voice warm, ready to talk about Steve with a love that never seemed to dim. People found that remarkable, beautiful even. But here's the question nobody thought to ask back then. What does it actually cost a child to grow up as the living symbol of a dead father? We will come back to that, because that question is at the center of everything. Bindi Irwin was born on July 24th, 1998. She was named after one of Steve's favorite crocodiles. Right there, before she could speak a word, her identity was already tangled up in something larger than herself. By the time she was old enough to understand cameras, cameras were already pointed at her. She appeared in wildlife documentaries beside her father. She had her own show, Bindi the Jungle Girl, which launched in 2027, the year after Steve died, and ran for 52 episodes. She was 9 years old when production began. She was doing press interviews. She was talking about her father on television with the composure of someone 3 times her age. The world called her inspiring, brave, a chip off the old block, and she was all of those things. But she was also a 9-year-old girl who had just lost her father, processing that grief, not in private, not slowly, but live in front of a global audience while wearing a smile that never quite reached her eyes in the early years, if you go back and watch closely. Robert came into public life a little later. He was simply too young at first, a toddler who barely had memories of Steve. He has said in interviews, quietly and without bitterness, that most of what he knows about his father he learned the same way the rest of us did. From footage, from documentaries, from watching a man he should have grown up with on a television screen instead. Sit with that for a moment. Imagine learning who your father was by watching him on YouTube. As the years went on, both children stepped further into the spotlight. Bindi won Dancing with the Stars in 2015 at 17. The audience loved her. She was articulate, warm, and emotional in a way that felt real rather than performed. When she dedicated her win to her father, there was not a dry eye in the building. Robert became a regular on American late-night television. His wildlife segments on The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon turned him into a viral sensation. A young man with his father's voice, his father's eyes, his father's laugh. Audiences who had grown up watching Steve Irwin saw a ghost in the best possible way. From the outside, the Irwin family looked like the definition of resilience. A mother who rebuilt, two children who honored their father's legacy with everything they had. But here's the thing about families that look perfect from the outside.
It's supporting very important work that is serious and that is, really changing the world, but also it's about approaching it with a sense of enthusiasm and passion and
The cracks are always there. You just have to know where to look. And by 2023, those cracks were no longer invisible. Something was shifting inside the Irwin family. Something that went beyond grief, beyond the normal friction of growing up, beyond the ordinary complications of a family business. Something that would eventually push Robert Irwin to break down publicly. Something that would force Terri to say things she had carefully avoided saying for years. And something that had everything to do with Bindi and the life she was quietly trying to build away from the cameras, away from the zoo, away from the weight of a name that was never just hers to carry. But to understand what broke, you first have to understand what Bindi Irwin was actually carrying. And that story is darker than most people know. Bindi, the girl who carried the name. She was 8 years old when the world handed her a job she never applied for. Keeper of the Flame, daughter of a legend. Living proof that Steve Irwin did not die in vain. 8 years old. And for the next 15 years, she carried it. Quietly, publicly, beautifully, by all appearances.
Imagine living with pain for a decade and being told it's all in your head. I'm proud to be joining with Talking Foreign Affairs and...
But there is a version of Bindi Irwin's story the cameras never fully captured. A version involving years of invisible suffering, a marriage that raised more questions than it answered, and a silence so loud that even her most loyal fans eventually started asking the one question nobody in her family wanted to answer. Where did Bindi go? Bindi Sue Irwin was born July the 24th, 1998, named after two of her father's favorite animals. Before she could form a full sentence, her identity was already a tribute to someone else. She grew up inside Australia Zoo, the way other children grow up inside family homes. The animals were her neighbors. The cameras were her wallpaper. Steve Irwin was everywhere. Then, in September 2006, he was gone. What happened next is the part most documentaries rush past. They show the tributes. They show Terri standing dignified while the world fell apart. Then they cut forward to Bindi at 9 years old on camera, smiling, honoring her father. What they never show is the in-between. The part where a little girl had to decide, consciously or not, that her grief was something to perform rather than something to feel. Because here is the uncomfortable truth about growing up famous inside a tragedy. The audience needs you to be okay. They need the story to have hope. And when the whole world is watching you for signs of that hope, you learn very quickly what face to put on. Bindi learned that face early. She wore it for a very long time. 2015. Bindi was 17 when she joined Dancing with the Stars in America. She won, and her partner, Derek Hough, took the trophy at the end of the season. When she dedicated the win to her father on that stage, people wept openly. Because in that moment, Bindi was not grieving. She was genuinely, visibly human. It was one of the most watched moments of that entire season. But here is something most people do not know about that same year. A young American wakeboarder from Florida named Chandler Powell visited the Australia Zoo as a tourist. He and Bindi crossed paths on what was supposed to be an ordinary afternoon. That single encounter would eventually set off a chain of events involving a secret wedding, a baby, a medical bombshell, and a family fracture that would push Robert Irwin to break down publicly. We will get to all of it. But first, the thing Bindi had been hiding. For over a decade, Bindi Irwin was in physical pain, every single day. In October 2023, she posted a medical disclosure that stopped people mid-scroll. She revealed she had been living with endometriosis for more than 10 years without a proper diagnosis. She described symptoms so severe that they left her unable to move. She talked about going to doctors repeatedly, about being dismissed, about being told the pain was normal. It was not normal. When she finally had surgery, doctors found 37 lesions on her reproductive organs. 37. Over a decade of suffering. Years of smiling on camera while her body was quietly destroying itself from the inside. Bindi had been performing wellness for a global audience the entire time, posting, smiling, showing up for every zoo event, every media appearance, every photo that said everything was fine.
It wasn't until I had surgery that I finally got answers. Doctors found 37 lesions and a large cyst. That moment, finally being heard, was...
And the entire time, she was in agony. That gap between what she was showing and what she was actually living tells you something essential about who Bindi Irwin is. It tells you she learned very young how to protect her audience from the harder version of the truth. She learned it at 8 years old. She was still doing it at 24. But the endometriosis was not the only thing she had been carrying. There was something else building quietly inside the Irwin family. And by 2023, it had become impossible to ignore. Chandler Powell and Bindi married on March the 25th, 2020, the day Australia entered COVID lockdown. No guests, no celebration, just the two of them and immediate family in the gardens of Australia Zoo. Their daughter, Grace Warrior, was born exactly 1 year later on the same date. From the outside, the picture was still perfect. Then, slowly and quietly, it started to change. Chandler began disappearing from certain photos. Family content felt more curated, more careful. Bindi and Robert were rarely photographed together anymore. In January 2024, Bindi broke her silence. Not dramatically, just a quiet social media post about feeling unsupported during her health crisis, about building boundaries around her immediate family, about choosing survival. She did not name anyone, and it was not necessary. Something had broken inside the Irwin family, not catastrophically, but genuinely, and Bindi was no longer pretending otherwise. Here is what I need you to hold. Bindi spent 15 years hiding her pain from the world. The moment she stopped, the image of the perfect Irwin family began unraveling. What Robert said publicly shortly after suggests the fracture went even deeper than anyone admitted. That is coming next. Robert, the one who kept smiling longest. If Bindi carried the grief, Robert carried the image, the easy grin, the quick wit, the way he could walk into a room full of strangers holding a venomous snake and make everyone feel completely at ease. He made it look effortless. That was the problem, because effortless is not the same as painless. And for a long time, Robert Irwin was the most convincing performer in a family full of them. But something cracked, publicly, unexpectedly, and when it did, nobody was ready for it. Robert Irwin was 2 years old when Steve died. 2 years old. He has no real memories of his father, none that belongs to him anyway. What he has instead is footage. Hundreds of hours of it. Steve Irwin running toward danger with a grin on his face, talking to cameras with a warmth that felt personal even on a television screen. Robert has said in interviews that watching that footage was how he got to know his father, not through shared mornings or bedtime conversations, but through a screen.
You were 2 years old when your dad died. I assume you don't have, or do you? Do you have any kind of sense memory?
Imagine that, learning from your father the way the rest of the world did, and then growing up to look exactly like him. Same jaw, same eyes, same voice. Same instinctive magnetic ease around animals that seems less like a skill and more like something written into the blood. When Robert stands in front of a camera, the resemblance is not subtle. It is striking in a way that visibly moves people who remember Steve.
I've been thinking a lot about kids and loss and how the death of a parent early on can completely change the trajectory of one's life. It certainly did with me. And I worry at times about not...
That is a remarkable thing to carry. Beautiful and heavy at the same time. Robert has handled it with a grace that most people twice his age could not manage. He turned it into something generous. Rather than running from the comparison, he leaned into his father's legacy with genuine love and made it his own. His wildlife segments on The Night Show became a viral phenomenon. Every appearance pulled millions of views. Audiences who grew up watching Steve Irwin watched Robert the same way, with a kind of joyful disbelief, like being given something back they thought was gone forever. By his early 20s, Robert had built a public identity that was both deeply connected to his father and distinctly his own. From the outside, he looked like the most healed person in the family. He was not. In 2023, Robert sat down for an interview that started like dozens of others he had given before. Wildlife questions, zoo updates, warm, easy conversation. And then something shifted. The interviewer asked about his father, about what it meant to carry Steve Irwin's legacy, standard territory. Robert had answered versions of that question 100 times. But this time he stopped. Not dramatically, not with a visible breakdown, just a pause that lasted a beat too long, a breath that caught slightly, eyes that moved somewhere else for a moment before coming back. And then quietly, he said something that reframed everything. He talked about grief that does not follow a timeline, about missing someone you never fully got to know, about the particular loneliness of growing up inside a legend so large that your own feelings about losing your father sometimes got buried underneath the world's feelings about losing theirs. The audience felt it instantly. Comments flooded in within hours. Not the usual fan enthusiasm, something quieter, more personal. People writing about their own losses, about fathers they had lost their lives too young, about the exhausting performance of being okay when you are not okay at all. Robert had said the true thing. The thing beneath the smiling wildlife segments, the Tonight Show appearances, and the carefully managed public image. And once he said it, it could not be unsaid. Here is what matters about that moment. Robert's breaking down publicly was not just about grief. It was a signal, a crack in the surface of a family that had been presenting one face to the world while living something considerably more complicated in private. Bindi had already broken her silence about her health and her boundaries. Now Robert had broken his heart about grief. This left Irwin still holding the line. Terri. And Terri's story is the one that explains everything else. Terri, 28 years of holding it together. There is a particular kind of strength that appears peaceful from the outside. Terri Irwin has it. She has had it for nearly 3 decades. That unshakable warmth, that steady smile, that ability to say Steve's name in public without flinching, without crumbling, without giving the watching world anything to worry about. People have called it inspiring, remarkable, superhuman even. But strength held too long without release does not stay strength forever. And in 2023, Terri Irwin finally showed the world what nearly 3 decades of holding it together actually costs. Terri Raines was born in Eugene, Oregon. She met Steve Irwin in 1991 when she visited Australia Zoo on a trip. She was 27. He was 29. They married 8 months later. That tells you everything you need to know about who Terri is. When she decides something, she commits completely. After Steve died, everyone expected her to leave, to take the children and go back to Oregon, to step away from a zoo, a brand, and a country that were all his before they were hers. She stayed. She took over Australia Zoo entirely. She managed the animals, the staff, the finances, the public relations, and the grief simultaneously and continuously without ever visibly buckling.
It's okay. Like, my kids never said, great, now we don't have to live in a zoo, you know?
Yeah.
They were just like, okay, now we have to keep doing this.
Yeah.
She raised 2 children in the eye of a global storm of mourning. She kept Steve's name alive with a dedication that never wavered. She gave thousands of interviews. She answered the same questions about loss and legacy over and over again with patience that seemed genuinely bottomless. And she did all of it alone. Terri has not remarried. When asked about it over the years, her answer has always been some version of the same thing. Steve was her person. That chapter is complete. She is not looking. Most people found that deeply moving, and it is. But it also means that for nearly 20 years, Terri Irwin has been carrying everything, the zoo, the legacy, the grief, the children, the public image, without a partner beside her. That is not superhuman. That is an enormous amount of weight for one person to hold. Here's the thing about Terri that gets left out of the highlight reel version of her story. She is extraordinarily good at managing perception, not in a dishonest way, but in the way of someone who understands instinctively that her audience needs her to be okay, that the zoo, the brand, and the legacy all depend on her remaining the steady center of a very large operation. So she remains steady, publicly, consistently, but there have been cracks. Small ones, easy to miss if you blink. In interviews over the years, Terri has occasionally said something that cuts through the carefully maintained warmth. A sentence that lands differently from everything around it. A moment where the real weight of what she carries becomes briefly visible before she pulls it back behind the smile. She once described the experience of watching Robert grow up to look exactly like Steve as something that takes her breath away. Not metaphorically, literally. She said some mornings she looks at her son and has to stop for a moment before she can continue with the day. That is not the statement of a woman who has finished grieving. That is the statement of a woman who grieves constantly and has simply become very skilled at doing it quietly. In 2023, as Bindi's health crisis became public and the tensions inside the family became harder to contain, something shifted in Terri too. She began saying things in interviews that she had not said before. Not accusations, not dramatic revelations, but honest things. Unguarded things. She spoke about the difficulty of watching her children suffer, about the helplessness of being a mother who cannot fix everything, about the complexity of a family that lives so much of its life in public while trying to protect the parts that are genuinely private. For a woman who had spent 20 years presenting seamless composure, these were significant admissions. The audience noticed. Because when Terri Irwin lets something real through, it does not look like other people's vulnerability. It looks like a wall is developing a fracture. And a fractured wall, as any engineer will tell you, does not stay standing without intervention. Here is the macro loop coming back around now. 3 members of the same family. All of them are quietly breaking in different directions. Bindi through her body and her boundaries. Robert through his grief and his honesty. Terri through the slow, exhausting weight of holding everything together alone. Something had to give, and it did. What happened inside the Irwin family between 2023 and 2024 is the part that finally brings all of this into focus. That is exactly where we are going next. The rift. What the evidence actually shows. Nobody in the Irwin family has said the word estrangement out loud. They have not had to. When a family that built its entire brand on togetherness suddenly stops appearing together, the absence speaks for itself. And by 2023, the absences were adding up in ways that were difficult to explain away. For years, the Irwin family content was relentlessly collective. Terri, Bindi, Robert, and later Chandler all together. Zoo events, holiday posts, birthday tributes. A visual language that said constantly, "We are a unit, we are whole, we are Steve's family, and we are still standing." That content did not disappear overnight. It faded, gradually, in a way that felt less like a decision and more like a slow withdrawal. Chandler Powell began appearing less frequently in Australia's zoo content. Not never, just less. Notably, less. In a way that fans who had followed the family for years found impossible to ignore. Bindi's own posting shifted. Less zoo, more Grace, more Chandler. More of a life being quietly built at a distance from the family center of gravity. And Terri and Robert, meanwhile, continued as before. Present, active, visible. A unit of two where there had previously been four. In early 2024, Bindi addressed the speculation directly, not with names, not with accusations, but with language that was precise enough to make its meaning clear. She spoke about choosing her immediate family first, about no longer shrinking herself to manage other people's comfort, about surviving her health crisis in an environment that was not always as supportive as it should have been. She used the word boundaries. She used it deliberately, and she posted a quote that circulated widely. It was about releasing relationships that require you to make yourself smaller in order to maintain them. Again, no names, but the direction was unmistakable. Here is the honest answer to what is happening inside the Irwin family. This is not an explosion. It is not a scandal. There is no single villain, no dramatic confrontation, no secret that demolishes everything. What it is quieter and more human than that. It is a daughter who spent 15 years subordinating her own identity to a family legacy and finally stopped. It is a husband who may never have been fully embraced by a family that already had its own gravitational pull. It is a mother trying to hold a legacy together while watching her children build lives that gradually require more independence from it. It is a family that loves each other and is struggling anyway. Those two things are not mutually exclusive, but the truth at the center of all of it is still waiting. And it is Robert and Terri's most recent words that finally pull it into the light. The truth that finally came out here is what this story was never really about. It was never about a feud, never about villains, never about a family falling apart in the dramatic tabloid way that headlines suggested. It was always about something quieter, something most families never have to navigate in public. What happens when love and grief and identity all get tangled up together, and the whole world is watching. Steve Irwin has been gone for nearly 20 years, and in many ways, he has never left. He is in the name above the zoo gates. He is in every wildlife segment Robert films. He is in the face that Terri sees every morning when her son walks into the room. He is in the legacy that Bindi was handed at 8 years old and has been negotiating ever since. That is not a criticism. That is simply the truth of what grief looks like when it belongs to an entire family, an entire nation, and an entire generation of people who grew up watching one man love the natural world with everything he had. But here's the part that matters. Grief shared that widely does not leave much room for the people who actually lost him. Bindi lost her father, Robert lost his father, Terri lost her husband. And for nearly 2 decades, their private loss has been wrapped inside a public legacy so enormous that the personal version of it almost got swallowed whole. What came out in 2023 and 2024 was not a family scandal. It was 3 people finally insisting that their private grief, their private lives, and their private needs were allowed to exist alongside the public legend. That is what Bindi's Boundaries post was really saying. That is what Robert's quiet breakdown was really about. That is what Terri's unguarded interview moments have been slowly building toward. In one of his most honest public moments, Robert said something that reframed the entire family narrative. He said that growing up as Steve Irwin's son meant that his own grief was often invisible, that the world's love for his father, as beautiful as it was, sometimes made it harder to simply miss him as a dad. Not a legend, not a brand, just a dad. That sentence landed like something that had been waiting a long time to be said out loud, because it gave permission to Bindi, to Terri, to every person watching who had ever felt their private pain crowded out by a larger public narrative. Bindi Irwin is building her life on her own terms. Her health is recovering. Grace Warrior is thriving. She and Chandler are quietly, determinedly constructing something that belongs to them. Robert is channeling his father's legacy with genuine love while carving out space for his own identity inside it. He is one of the most beloved young wildlife advocates in the world. He earned that independently. Terri is still standing, still running the zoo, still saying Steve's name with a love that has not dimmed across 20 years of saying it. And the family, fractured in some places and whole in others, is doing what families actually do, not performing resilience, living it imperfectly, honestly, together and apart in the complicated way that real love always looks. The truth that finally came out about the Irwin family is not a secret. It is simply this: they are human, all three of them. Fully, messily, beautifully human. And sometimes, the bravest thing a family can do is stop pretending otherwise. The Irwin family never asked to be a symbol. They became one anyway. And for nearly 20 years, they carried that weight with a grace that most of us will never fully understand. But symbols are not people. And people break. They struggle. They draw boundaries. They grieve in ways that do not always look pretty, public, or inspiring. What the Irwins showed us, in the end, is something far more valuable than perfection. They showed us what survival actually looks like.